And now I want to turn to tonight's speaker. During the period AD 1200 to 1600, just prior to European settlement, the Potomac Shenandoah region was occupied by a variety of indigenous Native American cultures. Tonight's presentation will be an opportunity for all of us to gain important insights about this often overlooked pre-European history of our region. Carole Nash, PhD and registered professional archaeologist. I had to look up RPA, registered professional archaeologist, is a professor in the School of Integrated Sciences at James Madison University, where she's taught for 35 years. Her research focuses on the Blue Ridge and Shenandoah Valley, specializing in First Peoples archaeology and historical ecology. She is author of many technical reports, scholarly papers, and publications, including she co-authored Foundations of Archaeology in the Middle Atlantic. She's president of Mountain Valley Archaeology, which partners with decedent communities on archaeological and historical research in Western Virginia. She also directs the Virginia Archaeological Certification Program, which sounded great to me, a citizen science initiative that partners professional and avocational archaeologists. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nash.
My grades are in. Thank you all so much for inviting me this evening. It is a real pleasure to be here. I've spent some time in this part of the nexus of the three states and feel very fortunate to always have the opportunity to come back and think about a lot of the things that I have been gathering with my students for the last decades, plural. And I will say that often when I have the opportunity to give this talk, I will have some time to sit down with it and really start to put together some ideas that I had not done, that I had not put together previously, and that is exactly what happened this evening. So I hope you will come along with me on this ride. It is a complex story, it is a fascinating story, and ultimately, the question that I would like you to keep in your minds as we go through this is, how do we not know this? How is it that we do not know these things? And so with that, we will get started. So first of all, I am not indigenous. My family has been in Virginia since 1625, and that is about 14 generations. I'm the first person to move west of the Blue Ridge, so my family is not adventurous at all, but that means I have a pretty strong network out in the Virginia Piedmont. But when I say that I do not speak for indigenous communities, one of the things that we have finally come to realize as archaeologists and historians is the fact that for so many years, the stories of indigenous people were told by folks like us, who use certain kinds of evidence and certain kinds of information to put stories together, make sense, logical, replicable, everything that you would expect to see from scientific study. And yet, there were people whose voices were missing in this work. And so today, as we go forward with this research, we really do look for partners from the Native American communities, and that's exactly what my work has benefited from in recent years. So these are the people who speak. These are the chiefs of the Virginia indigenous tribes and nations. In Virginia, there are 11 state-recognized tribes. There are seven of those are now federally recognized, and this is very new. And we'll talk more about that in just a little bit. But from upper left, that is Chief Steve Adkins of the Chickahominy, Chief Ann Richardson of the Rappahannock, Chief Keith Anderson of the Nansemond, Chief Robert Gray of the Pamunkey, Chief Diane Shields of the Monacan, Chief Gerald Stewart in the lower left from the Eastern Band Chickahominy, Chief Frank Adams from the Upper Mattaponi, Chief Mark Costello from the Mattaponi, Chief Bootsy Riggs from the Potomac. We have Chief Lynette Alston from the Nansemond, and Chief Walt Brown from the Chirwanakanataway. And so as I talk about this work today, these folks are always with me. They are always in the back of my mind as I am doing my work now. And they, of course, are very interested in the way that we put things together and the way that we tell stories. And more on that in just a little bit. But I do want to point out to you that there is a growing interest in figuring out who exactly was here, who lived in this area, who was in this place when Europeans arrived, and so forth. And more, the answer to that question is a number of Eastern Siouan tribes. And when I say Eastern Siouan, I'm talking about the language family. And the Eastern Siouan language family is known, for example, for the Catawba. You can start looking at other tribes, for example, in Virginia, and indeed, as you start putting all of these together, the Saponi, the Tutelo, the Monacan, all of them together, they have begun to think of themselves under the term Yisa, which is Eastern Siouan for the people. And their range, as you can see, encompasses where we are this evening. And so we'll be pinpointing a little bit more about that as we get into this, but we do acknowledge them. We do express our gratitude for their stewardship, and we commit ourselves to engaging with them. We commit ourselves to meaningful engagement that honors their futures, because the thing they tell me, every time I tell them I'm giving a talk on archaeology, they will say, "Don't forget we're still alive. We're still here. We're still here." And so one of the reasons I like to give this talk is because it allows me to remind everybody that they're still here. And so as we think about this in the context of the states that border Virginia, where I spend most of my time, there are no federally recognized tribes in Maryland. There are 3 state-recognized tribes, the Piscataway Conoy, the Piscataway Indian Nation, and then the Akahanak from the Eastern Shore. But you'll look at those dates, 2012, 2017. In Virginia, it wasn't until 1983 that the tribes were recognized by the state. And so as you start looking at the story of the people who are here today, one of the challenges that they have is demonstrating they are who they say they are, and demonstrating their families and their histories so that they can get some kind of formal recognition, which is something that is very important to them. And there are a number of ancestral communities in West Virginia, all over the state, that are small survivals, we think, of indigenous peoples. And indeed, they are not organized in a tribal configuration, so they are not recognized but when you get into West Virginia, no federally or state recognized tribes in West Virginia. I was looking into this, and there have been a number of bills introduced into the West Virginia legislature to develop a process for recognition, because you have to have a process for helping determine whether a tribe is indeed authentic. And this year, the bill was introduced again, and it seems to have died in committee, which is what has happened to it a number of times. But when you start looking at the history, these are all the people who are listed on the left: the Susquehannock, the Manitan, the Manahoac, the Shawnee, the Delaware, the Tutelo, the Mingo, Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois, Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois. And so they are in the history, they are in the records, they're in the archives. We see evidence of them in the archaeological records. So a lot of states in the eastern United States who took the brunt of European settlement, indeed, and whose communities had a great deal of difficulty surviving and were displaced, trying to put their stories back together again is exceedingly difficult. And so as we get into this tonight, we'll talk more about how the tribes, for example, in Virginia, as well as the Piscataway in particular in Maryland, are starting to come back from this and put their stories back together again. Now, I am always, I feel like it is my responsibility to tell you that the word Shenandoah does not mean daughter of the stars. And I am sorry, science ruins everything. I know. The time that I learned that the face of the man on the moon was basaltic lava flows, it just destroyed me. But what we are talking about is actually a tourism ploy that was created in the 19 teens and 1920s by the Virginia Tourism Association, when automobiles were first being sold and the Good Roads movement was creating roads that you could drive on, and they were trying to figure out how to get people to come west and come down into the valley. And so they launched these promotional campaigns in which they identified the word Shenandoah as meaning daughter of the stars. But it does not. We are still struggling to try to figure out the origin of that name. If you go back and look through all of the histories that have been written, the word is actually spelled in about 50 different ways, some that look nothing like Shenandoah. And when you put them together, some linguists will say this is a Central Algonquin name. Others will say it is Haudenosaunee or Iroquoian. And so we're now working with an Oneida linguist to try to take this apart and figure out what exactly that word is, the origin of that word. So this is something I'm often asked, what are the terms that we should use when we are talking about these communities, Native American, Indian, First Peoples, or Indigenous? And honestly, when you work with the tribes, the first thing they will tell you is, we just want you to know our name. We want you to know our tribal name. And there's a generational divide. There is no question that some of the tribes, the older members, refer to themselves as Indian. The younger members refer to themselves as First People, or they refer to themselves as Indigenous. And my guess is, as we move forward, we're going to see that change from themselves. But right now, there is a plethora. And honestly, I have never heard anyone say in a public forum, at least, don't call me that, because they recognize that these are names that have held on and have been part of their history as well. I typically use the term First People simply because I feel like that's important. I want to get that across when I talk about them. And for some of them, that's great, and others, they're like, eh. So there you go. But in order to tell the story that I want to tell you tonight, we have to move beyond the region. Of course, when we think about the Potomac and we think about the Shenandoah, of course, the basin of the Potomac that takes in the Shenandoah, that's a lot of land. But when you look at the story of the indigenous people, the first people who were here, the point is their networks went way beyond these rivers, went way beyond the Great Valley. And I just want to point out to you this wonderful geography, because I don't think we think about this enough. Shenandoah Valley is just one valley within the Great Valley system, and that north-south corridor that literally traverses the eastern United States has been a corridor of movement of people and a corridor of interaction for thousands of years. And so when you start thinking about the complexity of the tribes who lived in this area, come in please, when you begin thinking about their stories and you start thinking about the geography, you absolutely understand that what we are seeing here is the movement and interaction of people along a natural corridor that even today continues to have that kind of meaning as we think about movement and so forth. And so we are going tonight to not go all the way back. I wish we had time to do this. It would take a lot of hours to go all the way back to the first peoples. That would take us back to the end of the Ice Age, 15,000 years ago, to tell that story. Tonight we are focusing on the period that archaeologists refer to as the late woodland period. And archaeologists like to name things. We're very big on putting things into categories and naming things, as you're going to see. But I'm focusing on the time period from around AD 1100, AD 1200, up until the time of the European invasion, and then I'm going to be talking a little bit past that so we can get a better sense of why it has been so hard for us to tell this story. So just getting situated with this beautiful map of the Potomac watershed. I sometimes am surprised when I see this map. I forget just how big this watershed is and how connected it is to other regions. And so tonight we are going to be looking at the entire watershed, stories from the entire watershed during this 400 or 500 year period to set the stage. And so I also want to remind you all of something that I don't think we recognize often enough. We tend to think of the eastern United States and we think of the Atlantic, right? We think of the drainage of the rivers out to the Atlantic, to the coast, and that's important. But the Allegheny Front, which is not that far from here, you know, the Allegheny Front, is actually a continental divide. And so if you follow this map, what you're looking at, the Chesapeake Bay watershed, and the Potomac, of course, is part of that, drains out to the Atlantic, but you go over the Allegheny Front and get into southern West Virginia, you start getting into southwestern Virginia, and you are in the drainage that goes to the Gulf of Mexico. That is important. That is important because there were trade networks between all of these places that brought together these particular areas. And I think in some ways it is surprising when you realize just how far things were moving and how far people were connected to each other. I also want to throw in one more slide to get us situated, and this is our crazy geology. This is a map of Warren County, Virginia, so Front Royal, if you think of it of that shows the South Fork and the North Fork coming together at Front Royal, but it's a geology map, and the different colors are representing the different kinds of bedrock. And so we happen to live in an area where there is both connection because of the river, but isolation because of the mountains. And that has had a lot to do with the way that indigenous First Peoples communities established themselves, how they interacted with each other, and how they came to identify. And so I don't want us to take for granted the fact that we live in a remarkable place when it comes to studying this and thinking about the questions that we're looking at this evening. So never take the Blue Ridge for granted. When I first started in archaeology, the general thought was nothing really important ever happened west of the Blue Ridge. And I can tell you that is not true. All right. So we begin about 1,000 years ago with an archaeological culture that archaeologists refer to as the Albemarle culture. It is named for Albemarle County near Charlottesville, where this particular type of ceramic, the way that people made their pottery, is often taken as a marker of their culture, because pottery is something that can be shaped in so many different ways. Unlike making a spear point, where you have to break a rock in a particular way to get what you want, and you can only go so far, with pottery, it's plastic in a sense, and you can make many, many things out of it. And pottery is a very important expression of cultural identity. So this Albemarle culture had a particular way of making pottery found all through Western Virginia, the Blue Ridge, into the Piedmont region, up into the Potomac, coming over into Maryland, up toward the Monocacy. Now, what does that mean? That doesn't mean that there was a large village that controlled these areas. What it means is there was a particular kinship network, there was a particular community structure that linked together all of these people across this region. And these were the people who were living in what we call hamlets. They are small groupings where family members would come together, maybe 10 houses at the most, along rivers. But you'll notice that these are very much spread out. This is an artist's drawing of what one of these villages would look like from the Albemarle period. And these were folks who were still making their living a lot with hunting and gathering. So think back to that crazy geology and the topography and the fact that this place is a grocery store. This place, if you are a hunter-gatherer, this area is a major grocery store because there is food every season. There is food every season. You have to know how to get it. So I tell my students, what if I turned you loose in the woods in January? What would you eat? And of course, they're like, I don't know. And so we will have these discussions about you probably wouldn't eat very much, but we'll go forward from there. But it is amazing to me that as I look around the room this evening, every one of us, wherever we came from in the world, People in our past were hunters and gatherers. They had this knowledge. They somehow had this knowledge. Different cultures from Europe, from Asia, from Australia, and so forth. But this is how we got here. Hunting and gathering. 99% of our time on this planet as a species has been spent hunting and gathering, knowing wild foods, knowing when they are available and how to use them as medicines, how to use them as identity for communities as well. But it's absolutely amazing when you start thinking about that. One of the things that the Albemarle culture is known for, and I'll not be showing any images of these or any artifacts from them, are burial mounds. And this is something that is very unique to the upper Potomac and to the lower Shenandoah Valley. These are, when we talk about burial mounds, let me go forward here and then I will come back. We are talking about mounds that were above ground community cemeteries, 40 to 80 feet in diameter and from 5 to 15 feet high, big, containing the remains possibly of as many as 1,200 to 1,500 people. Okay? And these were positioned in locations around groupings of villages. So groupings of villages, the way that these burial mounds were used, individuals would pass, they would be buried in their own village, and then maybe there would be a village a mile away, and one that was 2 miles away, and so forth, and there's a mound in the middle. At a given time, maybe every 10 years, maybe every 20 years, whoever had passed was exhumed, and their remains were brought to the mound where they were buried together in a ceremony. And this is a really powerful statement of community in death. It really is. But if you think about these mounds that built up year after season, ritual event after ritual event, so that some of them were 15 feet high and 80 feet in diameter. These were really sacred areas. Now, I will tell you that none of them exist today in the form that they were left. Even Samuel Kercheval, the historian of the valley in 1833, uses the phrase melancholy regret that most of them had been plowed down because they are found on floodplains. They're found on floodplain soils where people like to plant corn. And so what you're looking at in this particular image is one in Rockingham County, the Linville Mound, and it is a map that shows you, we set up a grid with our transit, a surveyor's transit, and we mapped elevations, and you can still see the tiny bit that remains in the center. You can still see that darker color that shows you the core of that mound is still there, even though most of it is gone. We've been working a lot with Monacan Nation on trying to find what is left of these, because there were many of them in the upper Potomac and in the Shenandoah. And there is absolutely no doubt in our mind that they are Eastern Siouan in their burial tradition. And so they, as the descendants, are the ones who want to look after them. But one of the things that is very important to our discussion this evening is that when you look at the burial offerings that are in the mounds, some of them came from as far away as the Great Lakes. Copper from the Great Lakes, galena from Minnesota, and so forth. Shells from the Gulf Coast. So I want you to think about that. Here in Shenandoah Valley, Upper Potomac region, items are coming into this area from the Gulf of Mexico. They are coming in from the upper Great Lakes. So the question we ask ourselves is, how did those trade networks get established? How did those networks of the movement of these objects get established so that these things show up in our area? And we think that the networks actually go way back in time. Because remember, I said that we believe the people who blanketed this region were Eastern Siouan. Well, there are also Western Siouan, the people that you may know from Hollywood movies, the Lakota Sioux, for example. When you start thinking about the way in which we have been, I guess you could say we've sort of been taught to think of Native people, that is the icon that comes to mind. There was a split that occurred in the Ohio Valley somewhere around 5,000 years ago, and it looks like some of those people came east and some went west, and they were both speaking an ancestral Siouan language, and the ones who came east are the ones who settled here. And so we wonder whether or not they maintained connections in some way with those folks who ended up out west, because some of those people were living exactly in the area where these burial offerings are coming from. The next culture, moving forward, that we introduce you to, the Albemarle culture, sort of, I guess you could say it extends, but it also begins to contract and go more toward the Blue Ridge and over into the Piedmont. There's a new group of people who come into this area. Archaeologically, they're known as the Page culture. We're named after Page County, so Albemarle named after Albemarle County. Page, where the first work was done on these villages, very different groups of people. They are living in villages where the houses themselves are placed together in circular formation. And one of the things that I think is just amazing, and we can still do this, in the spring, it's too late now, but in the very early spring, when the grass first starts to green, if you know where to look, you will see the outline of their atis, or their wigwams. You'll see the outline of their houses where the wood rotted in the ground and left enough nutrients in the soil so that the grass is greener there than it is anywhere else around. And you can see the pattern of these houses. On the left, you're looking at almost an architect's drawing. Those are post molds. Those are where the posts rotted in the ground. And they show you the size and the shape of those houses. And these are known as ATI, or ATI. As I said, archaeologists like to name things, so depending upon who you talk to, you will sometimes see the Page culture referred to as Mason Island, which is, of course, one of the small islands out in the Potomac. But again, we've moved forward in time, 1100 to 1450 AD, so getting closer. But I want you to look at the distribution of this pottery. Look how different it is, first of all, from that Albemarle pottery that I showed you, and look at the distribution. Again, this is a distribution that mirrors the Albemarle culture, but it is a different way of life and a different culture. And so we have absolutely no evidence at all of warfare at any point in time. We have no evidence that there was conflict or abandonment. It appears that these cultures began to coalesce. It looks like this is one of those places where cultures began to coalesce. But this Page culture, extending up into Pennsylvania, out into through Maryland and the Piedmont, Virginia, as well as West Virginia. But there's something really interesting going on at this point in time. Where did these folks come from, and why did they show up here? If they are so different from the Albemarle culture that had been in place for 1,000 years at least, where did they come from? And one of the things that we know happened around 1,100 years ago, 1,000 years ago, is that there was a significant climate change. There was a drought. There was a terrible drought. And out in the Midwestern United States, some of you may be familiar with the term Mississippian. You may have heard about the Mississippian culture. And that is really not one culture. It is a group of cultures that were drawn underneath a particular way of life and ritual objects and so forth. But one of the things that happened is around 1100 AD, after building the largest city in North America that rivaled the size of any city in Europe, in St. Louis, Cahokia. After establishing Cahokia, not long after that, things started to fall apart. And it appears that the maize crop that was important to support a very large number of people began to fail in the drought, and folks began to disperse. And we see that shattering, we see that movement all across the eastern United States in the archaeological record. And so it appears that folks who had been part of the Mississippian culture, who lived in the Ohio Valley, began to move eastward because the drought was not quite as bad in this direction. And they came into the upper Potomac and started making their way down. And that's where we think they came from, but we're still trying to sort that out. We have many more questions than we do answers. But there's also one really amazing thing that happens with this movement, and that is corn, maize. Maize, as a domesticated crop, is something that was introduced in this part of North America very late. As I said, folks were doing quite well as hunter-gatherers. Populations were not out of hand. They were able to feed themselves. But as you can imagine, using up resources and having to move villages about every 30 years so that they had more wood, more deer, and things of that sort. But this is a game changer. When maize was introduced, it migrated, was brought across North America out of Mexico over the course of over 5,000 years before it finally ends up here. And there are hundreds of varieties. And the varieties that end up here are, this is a corn cob from one of the archaeological sites excavated along the Potomac. These are ears of corn that are about this big, and they have 8 rows. And so they're just one of the varieties. But when you see the license plate that say First Farmers of Virginia, I go, no, no, no. But it is truly amazing, because what corn did, it depends on the culture that you're talking about. It never became a full-on staple in the diet of anyone who lived in this region. Hunting and gathering was always important, but it became a trade item. It became a trade item, and if you actually look at who was allowed to eat corn, it was those who were of higher status. So it was not a food that was available to everyone, which I find really interesting. There's also another indication in this part of the East, in this part of the Middle Atlantic, that there was a movement of people from the Mississippian culture region here, and that is this, the chunky stone. It is a gaming stone. And if you can imagine, the upper right is a drawing by John Bartram of a chunky yard from Creek and Cherokee sites, still being played, but basically the idea is you have a clear yard, you have cleaned the grass, it is just clay floor, and you've got a basically a post in the middle, and you are throwing this rock. So it's not cornhole, but you get the idea, right? And except it takes an incredible amount of skill, because these stones are only about this big, and the hole is only about that big. So you can imagine this game, but we do find many of these stones. They start to show up at our archaeological sites around 1200, 1300 years ago. And they are not something that came from here, they came from outside. So now we have yet another group of people. The Kaiser culture, also known as the Luray culture, named for the Kaiser Farm site in Page County, where this type of site was first excavated by archaeologists. These are the really big towns, and we are talking about the time period from about AD 1400 until AD 1700. And you will notice that I'm continuing this well into what we call the historic period, because they were still here. They were still here. This culture was still here. They were still living in their towns. There are records of Europeans interacting with them. But let me tell you about the archaeology. So first of all, those page cultures that I was telling you about were situated in groups, and they began to coalesce, and they began to interact with this new group of people who came in, we think, directly from the Ohio Valley. And they brought with them a different way of making pottery, a different kind of village, and this is what they looked like. These are the towns. These are not villages, these are towns. And these are towns of several hundred people. And they were spaced throughout the Potomac, they were spaced throughout the Shenandoah Valley itself, and you get the idea that this is starting to be a pretty complex social organization. This is not just groups of families who are living together. There's something else going on here as well. But these palisaded villages. Now, I do want to mention one thing, and that is, it used to be that when we would talk about palisaded villages, folks would be thinking about the French and Indian War, and they would be thinking that these were defensive structures, but they're actually just woven fences. And more than likely, they were intended to keep animals out. They were probably used to keep animals out more than anything else, because they're not defensive structures. You can set them on fire very, very quickly, and they are not that tall. And so when you hear palisaded village, don't think warfare, because for so long that's what people did think. But whenever I see my friend Tom White, who teaches at Appalachian State, recently retired, did this based on one of our excavations of a Kaiser village. And when you start to see this, it really drives home the point that these are settled folks who are well ensconced in place and who know the area. But what's also interesting is that there are huge storage pits for food. And they're not just storing corn, they're not just storing beans, they are storing dried meat, they are storing wild foods, seeds and nuts that they have gathered. They are just filled with food. And of course, that is a strong indication that people are settling down, that they're staying put because they're generating surplus food, and they need a way to maintain it. On the left, this is the Hughes site in Montgomery County, Maryland, and if you follow the little dots, you can see some circles, and once again, the houses, the atis, that we introduced you to previously. One thing, though, that we have really come to appreciate just in the last 10 years is the fact that the Kaiser culture people were heavily engaged in deer hide trade long before the Europeans arrived. Long before there was a deer hide trade with Europeans, indigenous people were trading with each other. And we'll talk about why that is and how we know that in just a moment. But I want you to keep in mind that historically, we've got really good evidence to demonstrate that when Native people were hunting deer, for the longest time, they were going after the old bucks because the old bucks have the big skin, but also they are close to the end of their lives. The young bucks, the females, you rarely see them. You never see fawns in the assemblages of animal bones that we find at these archaeological sites. Once you get into the European period, the historic period, and the pressure of the deer hide trade starts to manifest itself, that changes. That changes pretty dramatically. But at these sites, the Kaiser village sites, before 200 years before the Europeans arrive, there is still this hunting pattern in place where the old bucks are taken and there are many, many hides that are being processed. We are finding evidence of basically they are taking large numbers of deer and they are processing them that are way beyond the needs that they would have had. And so the question is, where are they going? Well, shell beads, mussel shells. We talk a lot about the fresh water around here and the quality of water and the fact that we used to have a lot of mussels in the Shenandoah and then the Potomac River. We actually have good archaeological evidence of some of those species that are no longer in existence here. But what we have at these Kaiser sites are shell beads that are made out of freshwater mussel shells, but we also have shell beads that are made out of ribbed mussel shells that are coming from the coast. They're coming from the coast. So there is a trade in these beads, white, a very important color, a sacred color, essentially. So these shell beads are being traded back and forth. And the question is, who is getting the deer hide? Where are the deer hides going so that these shell beads that are coming from the coast are showing up here? Well, this is where the Potomac really comes into play, because there is another group of people that we introduce you to, known as the Potomac Creek culture. They are the ancestors of the modern Potomac. So for those of you who know the Potomac in Stafford County, outside of Fredericksburg, where their cultural center is, these are the people we are talking about. They lived on Potomac Creek. That was their core area in Stafford County. And again, look at their pottery. Very, very different from what we see in other parts of Virginia. But what's really amazing are the things that are found on their sites. So not only do you have this beautiful pottery, these palisaded villages, but there are also these what are called Chesapeake or running deer smoking pipes, tobacco pipes, that are being made in large quantities and that are being traded. And you can see the stippling. We think they were made, those designs were made with a shark's tooth. You can see the stippling, the design, and they're called running deer because if you turn the bowl, it's as though the deer is running. The deer is in, yeah, exactly. Shell masquettes. The shell masquettes, the Busicon that we find out here in the Atlantic, that makes its way all the way to the upper Great Lakes. So again, the trading network is maintained between the Potomac, the Shenandoah, and way out west. But the Potomac Creek culture, and this is the picture you're seeing on the left, is an archaeological image that shows you the Palisade, and it shows you excavations that were done over the course of many years in the 20th century. But this is a chief's area. This is a chief's site. This is no doubt a chief's site. And so the Potomac Creek people, interestingly enough, lived at the same sites as the Kaiser people. So if you look at the distribution of Kaiser ceramics and the distribution of Potomac Creek ceramics, they're at the same sites. And so they were connected to each other. So who are the Potomac Creek people? We think they may have been ancestral. It is possible. We're trying to figure that out with them, but they look like they may have connections to the Susquehannock. They may have connections to folks from Pennsylvania. And they moved into the Potomac Valley. And ultimately, at this time, when there is so much movement of different groups of people in place. So I want to show you what Virginia, and remember, at this time, of course, there was no Virginia, there was no West Virginia, but want you to look at the complexity of this map. I want you to look at the cultural traditions in this region where we live at the time of European colonization. When you look at these different groups, you are looking at different language families that are as unusual to each other as Russian and English are today. The coastal Algonquins, the Eastern Siouans in the middle, the Iroquoian speakers, the Haudenosaunee people who are the Nottoway and the Meherrin down in the Dismal Swamp area, Cherokee Iroquoian people in far southwestern Virginia. I understand that this place where we live historically has been a meeting place. It has been a place of mixing. It has been a place of cultural interaction. And a lot of that has to do with, again, it's a valley. People move through valleys. People are drawn to valleys and they move through valleys. And it's something to think about. Anybody who's a land use planner, keep that in mind. But I want to go a little bit further with this because it's not fair to just end the story there. There's so much more to tell you about. So first of all, this famous map from John Smith. John Smith, of course, got into a lot of trouble, caused a lot of trouble himself, but one of the things he did know how to do was make a map. And so he came up in 1608, came up the Rappahannock River and came up the James River as far as the falls, and in some instances even further, and began to document the villages that were there. He had already documented 200 coastal Algonquin villages that were part of the Powhatan chiefdom out in the coastal plain, and then he was interested in what was going on upriver. What's really amazing is Powhatan himself tried to dissuade, or Wahunsacot tried to dissuade John Smith from coming upriver by telling him that the Monacans and the Manahoac were cannibals, that they were going to, because Powhatan wanted to control the trade, and he knew that these folks were middlemen. He knew that these folks had the capability of intercepting, and so he did not want the Europeans establishing trading networks with, because he knew that was coming. And so it was really interesting. So John Smith says, I'm going anyway. I want to see what this place is like. And this is one of the most famous untold stories in American history. There was a skirmish at the falls of the Rappahannock River just above Fredericksburg in the summer of 1608 between a number of Manahoac, Eastern Siouan speaking people. A member of the Manahoac tribe was captured and brought to John Smith's boat and was questioned. And John Smith said, do you know who I am? Do you know who we are? And Amoralek, the warrior, said, we heard you were a people come from under the world to take our world from us. We heard you were a people come from under the world to take our world from us. Again, those networks, there is no question. The Virginia native people knew that the Spanish were in North Carolina. They knew that the French were coming down from Quebec. They knew that the English were there. They knew the Dutch and the Swedes were in Delaware. That was knowledge that they had. And so they were trying to prepare to figure out what was coming. So what is really fascinating, of course, is that John Smith, who wants reconnaissance, he wants information, he says, what's beyond the mountains then? Because he can kind of see the mountains in the background. And Amoralek said, the sun. What's beyond the mountains? The sun. He knew nothing else because the woods were not burnt. And that is a reference to the fact that in driving the deer, the Eastern Siouan people would set the woods on fire, and that was a hunting technique. And so he's saying, we don't know what's over there. Now, was he protecting whoever was over there? We don't know. But it is interesting that he would leave Smith with that story. Now, there's also something else that's happening at this time. By the time you get into the 1630s and 1640s, the English have moved into the interior and they are establishing trading posts. One of the most famous was Abraham Wood, who set up a post at Petersburg, and the Occoneechee Trail was accessed from Petersburg and ultimately going down into the Carolinas. And so that was stirring up all kinds of trouble there. But also the Beaver Wars. The Haudenosaunee had gotten tied into trading networks with the French and the Dutch. So see, this is a global story. This is a global story that is playing out right here. So the Haudenosaunee, the 5 nations of that confederacy in the 17th century began to move out of their areas in upstate New York around the Great Lakes and began to come down into the Middle Atlantic looking for beaver fur, because they had overhunted in their area and they knew there was beaver down here. And so they began to push down. There were wars. There was fighting. And essentially their economy had become dependent upon the European fur trade. The British and the Dutch, so again, this business of alliances and groups coming together. The British and the Dutch aligned with the Haudenosaunee. The French aligned with the Huron-Wendat and the Algonquin. And so they were setting these people up against each other who historically had really not had much to do with each other at all. By the mid-17th century, the Great Lakes, the beaver populations were pretty much gone. And that is when the Haudenosaunee began moving south. They began moving south, and the Dutch gave them guns. So there was constant warfare. The Europeans were terrified at what they had started, but ultimately the Haudenosaunee began to move people out. They began to move out other First Nations, and they were involved in the dispersal. They were part of this story. And so the Susquehannock from Pennsylvania and the Erie began to resist, but by the 1670s, the Haudenosaunee absorbed the Susquehannocks and moved west to the Ohio Valley. And that's a really typical kind of story. There will be conflict, but then ultimately people will join together, and that is exactly what was happening in the mid-17th century. These refugee communities were coming together and creating new communities. So there's that. But I want to tell you about the Barton site, which is in Allegheny County, west of here, on the north branch of the Potomac. Lower left there is the Fry-Jefferson map, lower right, the Fry-Jefferson map, 1751, that shows the Pennsylvania-Maryland line, but also includes North Mountain and the Allegheny front, and you can see how many Europeans there are. But if you also take a look at that, you will notice that there are references to Indian villages, to native villages. And so the Susquehannocks, who were trying to escape the Iroquois, started moving west, and they came up the Potomac, and some of them settled in the North Branch Valley at a place called the Barton site. It is very famous. It is now owned by the Archaeological Conservancy and protected in perpetuity. It will never be disturbed again. It was occupied by all the cultures that we've talked about this evening, and on top of that, a Susquehannock village. Okay, another example of this, by 1640, the Susquehannocks had moved into the South Branch of the Potomac Valley. They'd come down into what is now Pendleton County, down in that neck of the woods where Franklin, West Virginia is. And the excavations that have taken place at Upper Tract and at Moorfield are filled with European trade goods. So it's very clear that the Susquehannocks, again, are tied into these trading networks. This is the one from Moorfield. West Virginia, excavated a number of years ago. But imagine this time period when you've got the Europeans who are desperately trying to make their foothold in this place, trying to make alliances with the indigenous groups, and they are trying to hold on. I can only imagine what it must have been like to live here at that time. By 1674, the Haudenosaunee claimed to have removed all of the local tribes in Virginia and Western Virginia, and the governments of Virginia and Pennsylvania said, great, we don't have to worry about these people anymore. We can start settling to the west. And that was 1674, but they did not. They did not remove everybody. Here's a map from 1671. John Lederer, the famous German explorer who comes into Williamsburg and then makes his way into Western Virginia, coming into West Virginia, he is documenting native villages that are still being occupied in 1671. People are still here in 1671. Those of you who have an interest in Indian trails, and I know there is a lot of research that has been done on the native trails of West Virginia. And so, for example, the McCullough or Traders Trail, which George Washington used when he was doing his mapping, it's essentially Route 50. You can see that these trails were connecting these folks up. There is no question they were connected to each other. In Virginia, in 1677, the Articles of Peace, the Treaty of Middle Plantation, in which the tribes were told, you will have land, but we will be at peace with each other. There will be no more war. You are tributary to us, to the English crown. Now, what does that mean? Well, in 2007, when Queen Elizabeth came to Jamestown to commemorate the 400th anniversary, the first people she met with were the chiefs of the tribes before she met with the governor, because the English crown had treaty obligations to the Pamunkey and the Mattaponi in particular, and that's what you are seeing there. And so you tell me this is something that is from the past, it is very real. It is very, very real. And of course, those of you who know Virginia history know that the Wednesday before Thanksgiving every year, the Mattaponi and the Pamunkey bring the deer to the governor to pay taxes. That is the agreement from the Treaty of 1677, and they still hold to it. Every year there is that ceremony. 1697, the Piscataway, tired of dealing with the Susquehannocks, who are moving because of the Iroquois, and they start to move down the Potomac. They start to find their way into the Potomac Valley. 1699, as you look at the Potomac itself, right outside of Washington, D.C., Piscataway Indians were living in cabins on Heater's Island. So those of you who know the geography of the Potomac River, there is a very large late Native American town on Heater's Island. And so the Shawnee were here. There is no question. If you look at George Washington's map of Lord Fairfax's land, you will see Shawano Indian Fields deserted, Shawano Indian Fields deserted. That was 1737. How would he be able to see an Indian field deserted? It had not been deserted that long, right? It had not grown over. So just continuing with this, we could go on with this, but ultimately what happens is the political geography of the North American interior playing out right here, right where you are this evening, led to tremendous conflict. It led to confusion. It led to the loss of cultural integrity, and people began to join together in small refugee groups. It was very, very unstable, and of course the Europeans used this to their advantage. But I do want to show you this, because I can tell you this is one of the most amazing things I've ever seen. There was a Swiss explorer named Louis Michel in 1707. He comes up the Potomac, inspects the Monocacy, keeps coming, and then comes to Harper's Ferry, shoots down the Shenandoah. And by the time he gets to Cedar Creek, which is on the border between Shenandoah and Frederick County, so if you're on 81, you go right over Cedar Creek, he documented native houses there in 1707. Guess what? There is an archaeological site with radiocarbon dates that go to 1695. They were there. They were there. And so the Tuscarora migrate through out of North Carolina because of their war with the Iroquois. They have finally given up. They migrate. They become the Sixth Nation of the Iroquois. But before they do that, they migrate through the valley. They settle in Martinsburg for a little while, and then they make their way up along Conococheague Creek. They make their Tuscarora Creek, in the Maryland Piedmont, and then they make their way to Conestoga Town in Pennsylvania. And the Tuscarora Wars had an impact on the people who lived in this area as well. And in fact, it is pretty clear that some of the last remaining Tutelo, and there are Saponi today, but some of the last remaining native communities that were Eastern Siouan speakers migrated with the Tuscarora. And this man, Nicona, was known as the last Tutelo, and he was interviewed in 1870 and was still speaking Tutelo language, and he was living on the Grand Nations Reserve in Ontario, Canada. And so they followed and ended up there. So we could talk about the Treaty of Albany and the Treaty of Lancaster. I can go on about all of this, but this is when the colonies say, okay, we're going to formalize this, we're going to draw a line, and Haudenosaunee, this is yours, you're going to stay over here west of the Blue Ridge, and we are going to stay east of the Blue Ridge. That was the Treaty of Albany. Well, that lasted for about 2 years because, of course, Europeans started coming across the Blue Ridge into the valley. And so there was another treaty, 1744. The British are saying, just kidding, you can have the Ohio Valley, but we want the Shenandoah Valley. And so ultimately, what you end up with is this whole period in the 18th century where treaties were built and treaties were broken. That is part of the history of this region. It really is. And we don't know this because we never study these treaties. It's not part of what we do. But this just sort of shows you the colonial settlement according to the British. You can see all the way out to the Ohio Valley. But the Haudenosaunee thought that it was the Blue Ridge. So, of course, what does this do? It sets the stage for the French and Indian War. It sets the stage for the French and Indian War. Governor Spotswood is in the middle of this. He is trying to find the remaining native peoples who live in Western Virginia, which would encompass West Virginia as well. And he wanted to bring them all to this fort, Fort Christanna, down in Brunswick County. And that was supposed to be a school where the children of the folks in the interior were civilized and ultimately Christianized. And it only lasted for about 5 years. And so by the time you get to the early 18th century and you start reading the early histories, there's already this story that there's nobody in the valley. There's nobody in the Potomac. There's nobody in the Shenandoah. And so I always ask the question, who benefited from that story? And why has it been with us for 200 years? Why has that story been with us for 200 years? And so to show you what happened, 1735, there were 160 European families living west of the Blue Ridge. 1745, 10,000 Europeans. That's how fast. That's how fast it happened. 1756, in the Virginia colonial records, anybody who lives in the interior, regardless of their tribal affiliation, was referred to by the colony as Saponi. And so that's one of the reasons why we lose the history, is because it's hard to tell who's who, because they've all become Saponi in the eyes of the government. And he says, the Saponi live in peace among us. And I would say, ha to that, because of course, you're right on the edge of the French and Indian War. And we could really go into that as well, but we don't need to do that tonight. That's another talk. But that is essentially where I'm going to leave it. There is much more to this story, things that happened in the 20th century that have been impacting traditional societies in this part of the United States. But what I would like to just leave you with tonight is the idea that this is a place where many indigenous First Peoples lived, where they made their homes, where their cultures grew and flourished, where they were well established at the time of European settlement, and they did not just disappear. One historian referred to them, I'll never forget this, he said they silently melted away. And no, they are here, we just have to look. We have to do the work. And we have to look, and we have to work with the tribes themselves, because their oral traditions are strong. Even though many of their communities have really struggled to survive, the older folks, the elders, still remember the stories that were told to them. And so it's not beyond our reach, I don't believe, to help them put this back together again. So that's where we'll leave it tonight. Thank you for this. Are there questions? Anybody want to ask a question? Yes, please.
Well, I just have a comment. One of your slides used the term European invasion.
On purpose.
Well, of course, and I just have never heard that used, and it's terribly significant.
It is. I mean, I think there is, of course, a lot of discussion. There's always been a lot of discussion among historians. You know, what is colonialism? What does it mean to colonize? Well, it's an invasion. That is really the way you think about it. Any other part of the world, we would say that's an invasion. So why don't we call it that here? Yeah. Yes.
I've heard the number, 100 million indigenous people were here prior to the urbanization. Is that the number you use?
No, not at all. It's very difficult to estimate population because, of course, where is your evidence to put that back together again? One of the things that we do is we look at house size. So, for example, when I was able to say that one of the Kaiser villages probably had about 400 people living in it, that is because we understand how many people would live in a house that is, this big, right? And so, archaeologically, that's how we put these numbers back together. The best estimates that we have that are agreed upon is that out on the coast of Virginia, there were probably somewhere around 60 to 70,000 people. And as you come into the interior, there were lesser populations because, of course, you get your big groups out on the coast. That's where the resources and the travel is much easier. But the estimate, for example, for the Potomac and the Shenandoah valleys is that maybe there were 20,000 people here, something along those lines. Now, if you look at all of native North America, but you still wouldn't get 100 million. You have to understand that as people whose tradition is rooted in hunting and gathering, you don't have big families. That's not something that you would expect that has ever been documented in any culture like that around the world. There are really clear population controls within those communities. Yeah. Yeah.
I've seen maps from the 1730s and 40s that show a village near Martinsburg.
Yes.
A couple of villages on the other side of the river. What is the relationship of those people in 1730 to these people earlier?
So the question is, what do we make of the historic mapped villages that are placed in Martinsburg and then on the other side of the Potomac? One of the things that we know is that these were some of the last of the Kaiser culture, we believe. These are some, and all of those villages seem to be filled with refugees. There are different kinds of pottery, there are different kinds of house forms that are found in these places. So they seem to be kind of the last stand of some of these communities. Yeah. But
They sometimes say
Shawano or Shawnee, right. The thing that I will leave you all with as well, a thought that I would like to give you is there has been so little work done in this area, believe it or not. One would think that given the richness of the archaeological record that we have along the Potomac and the history that we have along the Potomac and the Shenandoah, that we would know a whole lot more than we do, but we don't. And in part, it has to do with the fact that in the United States, archaeology for the last 50 years has largely been controlled by what is called the National Historic Preservation Act, Section 106. And this is the law that requires archaeology to be done when federal money or federal permits are used to disturb the ground. And that is, so you can imagine in Fairfax County, Virginia, there are thousands of archaeological sites that are documented because of all the development that has occurred. So on the one hand, while we love our rural communities and want to maintain that, what it means for archaeologists is that we don't see the archaeology kind of gearing up in the way that it has in other areas. And so we rely very heavily on local folks who know where sites are and who have made collections of artifacts. My doctoral dissertation was working in Madison County with farmers and going with them into the fields to look at the sites that they knew about because nothing had been documented down there in that part of the Piedmont. And so we're not quite at that point here, but there is a tremendous amount of work that needs to be done so that we can better answer the question that you just asked. Yes.
I have kind of a related question. So I liked your slide about the sort of the useful narrative going being the valley, because that's what you sort of hear about in Jeffersontown, is that it was a hunting ground.
Right.
And nobody had permanent settlement. But
Right.
I was wondering, aside from archaeology, are there other sort of ways of looking at sources that are developing in your field, or like alternative?
Absolutely, yeah. I think we're getting a lot better at reading colonial records to start with. I think we're getting a lot better at understanding what was actually written in court records. But I think that what is really important in this discussion is bringing in tribal partners, oral history as well, particularly for those whose communities held a core of land in the area where we know their ancestors were living. That has become absolutely indispensable in the work that we're doing because there is such a rupture in the historic record. But to tell you the truth, when you hear that story that the valley was just a hunting ground, you know, nobody really lived here, that is what the Haudenosaunee wanted folks to believe. You see, and the colony, that was written in the records. Nobody's over there. We'll leave them alone. You know, we don't want them coming across the Blue Ridge to bother us out in the coastal plains. So you all stay over there. It's a hunting ground. Good. That's fine. When really we know it was much more than that. Yeah. We know it was much more than that. Yeah.
You mentioned a few artifacts in the house forms. There were slides that had pottery.
Yes.
And I think there was one that had arrowheads. What other types of artifacts have been found from the woodland period?
That is a wonderful question. We live in an area where the soil is very acidic in the eastern United States, and so moist most of the time. It is not the kind of condition in which you find perishable items. You don't find the skin bags, you don't find the woven mats, you don't find the clothing because that's all gone. What we find are the things that stay around, like the pottery, the lithics and things of that sort. But in the village sites that have been excavated, particularly, now this is really interesting, out at the Kaiser Farm site, and we see this on all of the village sites where they are very clearly using a lot of freshwater mussel shells. When you have a pit and you throw a lot of mussel shells in it and you put animal bone in it as well, over time, the ions from the shell, the calcium will replace the calcium in the bone so that the bone doesn't rot. And you actually so we have lots and lots of animal bone from these sites, and we've been able to reconstruct diet. If we have charred corn, that preserves. So a lot of times it has to do with the context in which it is found and the condition of the site as to what is actually there. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, there's a little chemistry action there. Yeah.
Could you say a little bit more about the Mississippian people, like maybe even east of Opium, the man side and so forth, and the extent to which they influence people?
Well, that is a wonderful question too. When we talk about this thing called Mississippian, people have the idea that somehow there was this uniform culture that blanketed the entire Mississippi basin and extended into the southeast and over into Oklahoma, because there are artifacts and temple mounds and things of that sort that are found in the heartland that are also found in these locations. But what we now understand about the Mississippian peoples is that they were loosely allied. They were different cultural groups living in particular large river valleys who were allied with the Mississippian but were not necessarily part of that big core in the heartland. The closest that we get to actual Mississippian sites where we are now is in southwestern Virginia. There are a few Temple Mound sites in southwestern Virginia. Then you get into North Carolina and you really start to see them in the mountains. So there's no question that there was some really strong direct influence from the Mississippian culture, but it did not make it up into this part of the world except through some of the more peripheral trade. That's what, yeah. Yeah, yes.
Couldn't help but notice that the founding of Shepherdstown is right in between the two treaties that you talked about.
Exactly.
Could you say a little bit more about fleshing that out?
Well, I know there are people here who know that history a lot better than I do, but it absolutely is the case that once the treaties, if we go back here for just a second, let me go back to my treaty slide. There we go, whoops. Once the Treaty of Albany was signed, the British essentially took that as an indication that it was okay to settle. And so they began to really encourage settlement. Lord Fairfax, for example, at that point had started to sell land. He had started to divest. He begun to divest himself of some of his properties. And ultimately, there was just a strong push to settle in the upper Potomac, in the upper Rappahannock. You see it in all of the river systems in Virginia. The colonial government is pushing to get settlements because they want taxes. They want taxes, they want courthouses, and they want taxes. And they also want buffers against the Haudenosaunee.
Even though the Treaty of Albany said no further west than the
Yep,
Blue Ridge. They
that's
saw
right.
that as an implication.
That's right, that's right. They sort of said, oh, yeah, west of the Blue Ridge, yeah, yeah, yeah. But Shepherdstown is pretty much right on par with the settlement of other towns from that time period as well. So it was all happening at the same time. Yeah, yep. Yes,
I am Shenandoah Shawnee, and I want to thank you for your presentation. It's been very educational, and I appreciate it.
thank you for being here.
It's been my life to knit together my ancestors and their history. And I would love to sit down with you even further and tell you some of my
Wow.
history that's been passed down.
That would be wonderful.
And to get your opinion about that.
Sure.
Sometimes I think, is this my imagination, or did my grandmother really say this?
Right, right.
So I would appreciate that, and I appreciate you.
Thank you. I appreciate hearing that, and I would love to have that opportunity. And that really is very gracious of you to offer that. One thing I will say is that in Virginia, and I have slides, but I'm not going to go through them, this is the 100th anniversary of the Racial Integrity Act. The Racial Integrity Act was passed in Virginia in 1924. It was the most extreme eugenics law that was ever passed in the United States. And the Director of Vital Statistics removed from existence the category of Native. From 1924 until 1967, so not that long ago, in the state of Virginia, you could not legally be identified as a Native person because he believed there had been miscegenation, there had been mixing of blood, and that ultimately they were all black. That they were all black, and that there were two groups of people in Virginia, there were white and there were colored, and that if you had a drop of Native blood, you were considered to be black. And the communities really went underground at that point. They sent their children away and they went underground. And so when I tell you that that law was not repealed, only a part of that law was repealed in 1967. The Sterilization Act was not repealed until 1975. And it wasn't until 1979 that the Racial Integrity Act was fully repealed. And so it has only been a generation since that was the existence of those folks. West Virginia had a Forced Sterilization Act from 1929 to 1956. Maryland did not have laws, but Virginia was the most extreme. And so what we are finding now is that building trust, universities building trust with tribes is some of the most important work that we can do because the universities were not there when this was happening. Universities were teaching eugenics when this was happening. And so, as the chiefs say to us on a regular basis, where were you? Where were you when this was happening? But one of the things we are beginning to realize is that families themselves, like yours, held on to stories, they held on to seeds. They held on to varieties of corn and squash that you will not find in stores, but they have been passed through family lines and it's still there. And so they have been tending this, they've been waiting. And so now it's starting to feel safe again. It's starting to feel like the stories can be told. And when we think about what that must have meant, you know, to those families, to know that legally they could not exist in the place where they were the first people. You can only imagine the trauma that left. And It's generational, there's no question, but the young people within, there now about in Virginia, 7,000 folks who are identified as members of the 11 tribes. And there are many more indigenous in Virginia and of course in Maryland and West Virginia. But the younger folks are now taking this knowledge and are just running with it. They're like, we are strong and we're coming back from this. And so as you listen to these stories and you talk about the invisibility, because that's what it is, it's invisibility. One of the reasons the invisibility persisted is because of not what happened in the 18th century, but what happened in the 20th century. It's recent. It's recent, yeah. So as we start putting together the Piscataway, the Potomac, we begin listening to the Shawnee and hearing their stories, we also have to be open to hearing what happened. We have to be open to acknowledging what happened and taking responsibility for that, because good citizens let that happen. And so, you know, when we start thinking about it in that perspective and we begin thinking about our responsibility, of course it is our responsibility to tell the story. Of course it is. And so that's why I'm so grateful that I have the chance to do that. All right, I think we're done.